Well, welcome everybody. This is a webinar specifically targeted at data required from non-public, non-sectarian schools to be provided to the districts whose students they serve. And we're going to go over the incident data submission, or what was previously called the student discipline data submission. The meeting materials that I'm referencing today and that we're going to be talking about today, there are links to it obviously in the PowerPoint, and you can download the PowerPoint along with those associated documents at that CDE box link that I just put in at the 206 timestamp, and I'll just go ahead and put it in one more time. Our presenters today, I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So Shiloh, let's start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shiloh Duncan Bessariel. I am the Associate Director for Special Education here at the California Department of Education. But many of you know me in my prior role, which I was the Data Administrator for Special Education and worked very closely with Brandy as we migrated the special education data into CalPADS over a period, I think, of like 5 years. And so I wanted us to sort of come back again today to talk a little bit more about this data and sort of what we've seen in the last couple of submissions, and then kind of re-ground us in the requirements. So thank you so much for joining. It's nice to see you too, Pam.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Nathaniel Holmes. I'm a client services representative with CSIS. I'm a trainer, so I've had the pleasure of tagging along behind Brandy and Shiloh as we transition from CASEMS to CalPADS, and when we previously did this iteration of the NPS training. So for all the familiar names I see in the chat box, hello again. And those unfamiliar names, I look forward to establishing communications with you. So I look forward to today's training.
And for those of you that do not know me, my name is Brandy Howdigi. I work in the education data management. Specifically, I work on the CalPADS project and have been doing that for about the last 15 years. So thank you all for attending today. We look forward to sharing lots of really good information with you. If you do have questions, I would ask that you put your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat. Reserve the chat for conversations with your colleagues, or if you want to make general comments. But if you have specific questions, if you will put them in the Q&A, it'll make things a lot easier. So reserve the Q&A for solely questions about the content we're talking about here today, and then use the chat for conversations with your colleagues and just general comments. So that will make things move a lot smoother. So if you do have questions about any of the content, please feel free to drop it there. Okay, Shiloh, take it away.
So the purpose of, so as you know, about, I would say almost feels like we've been home forever, but I believe it was 3 short years ago, a law passed called AB 2657, which made significant changes to Education Code 49005. And that education code really identified restraint and seclusion data as a particular set of data of interest, and it required LEAs to collect that data and submit it to the CDE. And so we worked with a broad stakeholder group to identify the best manner in which to collect this data. And now we are collecting the data through CalPADS. And so we really wanted to, the purpose of this training today and what we want to do with this data is to really identify how you can best submit this data, because we will use this data for both public reporting and we will use this data for monitoring. So it's important that we have a really good perspective on what the data looks like and what we need, and that it's very high quality data. And so we want to provide this training to support both LEAs and non-public schools in submitting this data accurately. So obviously there's requirements associated with it. This is part of the Every Student Succeeds Act requirements. This identifies instances where we have problems at schools that we want to address. It also allows us to look at suspension, expulsion, and also incident accounts underneath our IDEA responsibilities. It is going to be part of our monitoring responsibilities, which is an IDEA requirement, and it fulfills the requirements under AB 2657, which is codified in Education Code 49005. So next slide, please. So incidents involving violations of Education Code sections 4900, 48900, and 48915, even if they did not result in suspension expulsion. We also want incidences of restraints and seclusions, even if they were not in violation of Education Code sections. So we want violations of Education Code, but we also want restraints and seclusions, even if they were not part of the violations of Education Code. So you can refer to 49005. I've been talking a little bit before that. And we also have a flash that we've done a while ago. I know we're up to many higher flash numbers than this, but this flash 159 for a summary of how we restructured the discipline file to account for the changes to 49005. So that's kind of where we would begin to look at. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the data we have received. So we started to collect this data in 2019-20, and we had, and we've collected in 2021. Now, we do recognize that the entire world changed in the spring of 2020, and that many school districts were still not in in-person instruction in 2020 and 2021. And so this data has been inconsistent, to say, and that's not any fault to any individual person or LEA. It's just because this data is complicated to collect, but it's also very difficult to collect in any sort of remote setting. Not impossible. It's just part of what happened in the world, but we do want to sort of reset and understand a little bit more. So let's talk about the data we did see. So in 2019-20, we would have had an almost full year of data. So remember, schools for the most part closed in March 17th of 2020, and most students moved to distance learning. And so we would have had from July 1 all the way up until that time, we would have had incidences, and there may have been incidences that occurred in non-public schools that stayed open or stayed accessible to students. So you see, we had about 8,000 records reported during that year. The number of LEAs reported were 313. However, 1,631 LEAs, that includes our charter LEAs, did not report any incidences. Now, some LEAs we can expect not to report any incidences, but this is a very high number of LEAs reporting no incidences at all. So that indicates to us that there may not be a process in place for collecting this data and reporting it correctly. So we just want to make sure that we have that in place. You can see that's mirrored in our 2021 data. So in 2020, in 2020-21, it's a lot of 20s, most districts were still in distance learning for a good portion of the year. For example, my son's school didn't go back until I think March of that year. And so obviously we would expect fewer incidences to occur because students were not physically in school. And so we still had incidents occur, about 2,300. Only 173 LEAs reported any incidences at all, and so 1,700 reported no incidences at all. And so again, we do want to see all LEAs have a process in place, even if they do not submit because they did not have any occur, but there is a process in place. This data indicates to us that there was no process potentially in place in many LEAs for reporting. So you have incidences of restraint reported. You can see there about 7,500, almost 7,500 in 1920, about 2,000 in 2021. Most of them are physical restraints, which is what we would expect to see. And then instances of seclusion, about 800 in 1920, and then 202 in 2021. So sort of an indication of the data that we are seeing. I think we're not seeing the numbers from LEAs that we would expect to see based on the size of an LEA. So if you have an LEA that has, say, 30,000 students, we would expect to see potentially even one incident. And we did have a number of LEAs of that size who'd had no incidences at all. So it's a very good, timely point to be making this presentation and to be giving you all this information. So
Shiloh, there's a question that is, do we have a, do you have an idea of how many of these are NPS?
We have not.
Reported by NPS? Okay.
We don't have it broken down by NPS, but we do know it is a relatively high number. It's usually between 30 and 40% of incidences that occur are going to happen in a non-public school. So, but I'm happy to look at that data a little bit closer and provide the information. Because our non-public schools tend to be our more restrictive environments, and they have students who have more behavior problems, they will tend to have more a higher percentage, if you will, of students who experience restraint and seclusion. That doesn't mean that the non-public school did anything wrong. It's just that's something we want to be able to see and monitor. And if the data is not being reported, it's harder for us to see. Okay.
Okay, so what are our expectations? So the incident data are collected as part of the CalPADS end of year 3 submission. And all of these data are currently stored in an LEA's local student information system. At your NPS schools, you actually have your own student information systems. But the intent is that NPS schools are going to provide LEAs the data that they would need to input this into their student information systems. So our end of year submission is capturing data on incidents that occur, whose occurrence dates are between July 1st of the academic year through June 30th of the academic year. And again, NPS sites, we know that you track these separately within your own student information systems, but what is important is that at some point or somewhere within that student information system or in a separate repository, you need to be able to track all of the data that is necessary for state reporting for incidents for students at NPS schools that have been referred by California school districts. And that is an IDEA requirement. Okay, the other thing is you have to have policies and procedures in place to make sure that you are capturing incidents of restraint and seclusion. So for those of you in the student information system realm in LEAs, most of you know these as behavioral emergency reports. And a lot of the information that you need to report restraint and seclusion is captured in a behavioral emergency report. It may be similar at NPS schools, but you have to have clear documentation as to what constitutes restraint, physical and mechanical, what constitutes seclusion. And remember that we're not just capturing this information for students with disabilities, we're actually capturing it for all students, general ed students, as well as students with disabilities. So it's important that staff at NPS schools, as well as staff in LEAs, are trained to identify, document, and report these data to the states. CalPADS administrators, and those of you that are data coordinators at CalPADS, it's not your responsibility to determine what records or which incidents constitute or incident results constitute restraint, physical restraint, and mechanical or seclusion, right? That's actually up to an administrator. So just be aware of that. Okay, take it away, Nate.
So we're going to discuss some terminology, and the reason for this is what you may describe or use in practice is going to be different from what's needed in CalPADS in terms of data collection and reporting. And so when we report an incident, we're describing an event, and that incident for reporting purposes is a behavioral emergency or the result of a student offense that results in physical or mechanical restraint, seclusion, or the recording and the result of offenses committed. And so an incident result is the outcome. And we've changed the name from discipline to incident and incident result because not all outcomes are punitive. Not all outcomes are a result of a disciplinary measure in the case of behavioral emergencies, of course. And you know, restorative justice or alternate discipline measures aren't the traditional outcomes or disciplinary outcomes. And then, of course, the statutory offense These are student violations that are outlined in Ed Code sections 48900 and 48915. And 48900 in particular identifies the offenses in which students can be suspended, and 48915 describes those in which a student may be expelled. And then seclusion, I found this one to be a little bit personal. And the definition, of course, is the involuntary confinement of a pupil alone in a room or area in which the pupil is physically prevented. And I see that there was a question about this in the Q&A. It refers to restraints and seclusion. The reason why I find this personal is I was in 8th grade and I was removed because I talked a lot. And, you know, I wasn't exactly secluded because there was nothing physically preventing me from my seclusion or my isolation from the other students. So it's important. I think Shiloh showed you this, the way the statistics were reported, that this is, you know, the definitions are clearly defined locally so that you know what you're reporting accurately. And then behavioral restraint, you have two types, mechanical and physical restraint. Mechanical being the use of a device or equipment to restrict a student's movement or freedom of movement. And then physical restraint is the personal restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to move his torso, arms, legs, and head freely. And there's exceptions to this. If a student is being removed by the authorities, being the police at some point, handcuffing the student wouldn't be physical restraint in that definition. So you do need to research a broader definition, and that's why we give you the Ed Code, so that you can get, you know, the law. So, you know, you want to make sure that your student policies and procedures fall in line with Ed Code, and you're familiar with this terminology. Next slide, Brandy.
So can I, before you go on, Nate, Shiloh, are there any districts out there that you feel would be representative of having good policies and procedures in place? I know at some point somebody had pointed out Clovis.
Clovis is a good one. I think there are a few that have done it. I can go and find and see if we have identified them. These, and I saw the question about, like, these are so vague, it's really difficult, and we understand that, and I think where we've tried to be, you know, as clarifying as we possibly can without reinterpreting the legislation, and that's kind of where it gets a little bit complicated. So I would say that is one area we understand that, we hear you. We have not been able to kind of get into a very detailed description yet. We may get there at some point soon, but we're not there at this time. What I will say is we can look to other LEAs, and I can definitely have the discussion with our special education local plan areas to determine if there might be some best practices that exist out there. Clovis is one that we do typically point to because they brought together a really interdisciplinary state educational partner group to flesh out these definitions and to provide district-wide training to all of their staff on this. So we'll continue to look at that. I will definitely share the joy.
All right, so in terms of reporting incident scenarios, and those of you representatives at NPS schools, this is what your school districts, your county offices, and charter schools have to collect information for, all the different types of scenarios. And of course, this can't represent everyone. So it starts with the incident, the big red bubble in the middle, and there's different elements. So each incident is going to have a student. That student was involved in the event. If you have an incident, you have to tell us the result, whether there was suspension, expulsion, the use of restraints, or if the student was secluded, even if the student received no discipline, right? That is required. So if you look at scenario one, this is a common example. You have a single student incident. There's a result that's the outcome of the incident, and this particular student committed 2 offenses, right? And so we're not going to go over every scenario, but if you would look at scenario 4, just for contrast, you have 2 bubbles, the purple and the orange bubble, and the red incident bubble. So this is a 2-student incident. And you can see that the purple student has 1 result and 2 offenses, right? Maybe that student was expelled or suspended. Whereas the orange colored or yellow colored student has 2 results. That student may have in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension. And so those are 2 separate results and a single offense. So there's a great variation in how the data is collected. And so that belies the point of you having accurate way to collect the data. You know what data needs to be collected. And there's communication between, the NPS school and the LEA representative or the CalPADS data coordinator who will be submitting this data. I'm ready for the next one. So this is just another graphic, again, to kind of organize. We're not going over individual field elements in this slide. However, you're going to have key data that you need to relate. And so, when you're providing information about a student incident or incident that involves multiple students, the incident date, an incident ID may be useful in that it may not be the same ID used when the data is submitted to CalPADS. But if you have multiple unrelated incidents at your NPS school, how is your CalPADS coordinator going to identify those 2 separate incidents? So you want an incident date, some type of identification ID, and then the students involved. If you have local ID numbers, addition to names, or if you have their SSID, that's all important in the incident. And then you're going to have the incident result. What was the outcomes for the student? If there's multiple outcomes, provide a list of all the outcomes per student for each incident, and then the student offense. If it was offense that was outlined in Ed Code sections 48900 or 48915, or the behavioral emergency where there was restraints or seclusion, you want to provide that information as well. And the important thing, if we go to the next slide, I believe, well, the next 2 slides, is that this information is coming from 3 different files. And so that's why we're going to provide you some tools that may help, but you want to be as thorough as possible because this information is submitted to CalPADS in 3 different files. It's too much data, too detailed and too varied to submit in a single file, right? And so your CalPADS data coordinator is first going to have to identify the students involved in the incident, and each student record in that incident has specific student attributes, but also attributes that tie all the students to that incident. So that's when we're talking about the incident date and incident ID. And then every student involved in the incident will have a result. There's going to be an outcome. Again, we talked about the different outcomes or the different possible outcomes. And again, that list is varied. And then you're going to have the offenses for those students who were not involved in a behavioral emergency, those students that committed Ed Code violations or violations that are outlined in 48900 and 48915. So those 3 files are submitted and describe an incident, right? So it's going to be a lot of data, which Brandy has the pleasure of covering just shortly. And the next one. And so this kind of helps you visualize, if you're not the person submitting data to CalPADS, how the record should go in and why it's important to have all the descriptive elements and why we're holding this webinar. First, your students are going to be enrolled at your NPS school in CalPADS. If you have an incident, you're going to have to establish that incident, whether it's a single student incident or multiple student incident. And then you're always required to have a result for each student in that incident. There has to be a matching record. For every student identified in the incident file, there's going to be a student results file. That's the SIRS at the bottom. And then again, any student with an offense, they have to have an offense record. But the SOF or the student offense file is not strictly required. Again, a great example is behavioral emergencies. Those students may not have committed any violations. They may have not done anything necessarily wrong, right? It was just an emergency that required restraint or seclusion for their safety or the safety of others. So we wouldn't always see a SOF file or a student offense file, but you always will have an incident and a student results record. All right, we're ready. Take
Okay.
it away.
Thanks, Nate. So what you're looking at here is one of the first files that Nate referred to. It's the student incident file. So I had a question that was in the Q&A, and I just kind of wanted to address it because for some of you, particularly those staff at NPS schools, this may be the first time you're actually hearing this information. And so somebody asked, well, what is the difference between an incident and an offense? Okay, so you need to think of student incidents as being at the very top of the hierarchy. Okay, a student incident is an event that involves one or more students, and those students within that event may have committed one or more offenses, violations of ed code, or that incident may have resulted in restraint or seclusion, or both for a particular student, right? So the offense is sort of a component of an incident, okay? But an incident involves one or more students. So it's an event that happens on a certain date that involves one or more students. Those students may have committed one or more education code violations, or that event may have resulted in restraint or seclusion for those students. So I hope that kind of explains the hierarchy in terms of these different file types. Now, when you're documenting the student incident, if you look at the columns at the top that are bolded, okay, so we've got incident ID local, we've got incident occurrence date, statutory offense indicator, student instructional support indicator, and then removal to interim alternative setting code. All of those are highlighted because those are actually really key fields in this particular file, okay? This is really important information. So what we've done here is we've created two fake incidents. So you'll see incident number 1 occurred on July 1st, 2019, and the LEA, or in your case, an NPS, would create a unique incident identifier. So each incident that involves one or more students should have one identifier. In this case, there were 2 students involved. So we've got pseudo student and phony pupil. And as you can see, both of these students committed what's called a statutory offense, which I'll explain in just a second. They also received instructional support for this particular incident, which I'll talk about in a second. And neither of them were removed to an interim alternative setting, which is, as you in the community that serves students with disabilities, you know those as 45-day placements. Okay, so let's talk about the incident ID. The incident ID is what makes an incident unique. Okay, so an incident is unique because it involves a specific group of students and it's an event that occurred on a specific date. In this case, it was July 1st, 2019. The incident occurrence date is the date that the incident occurred, not the date that the incident result was administered. So for example, if it resulted in suspension or expulsion, and that happens after the incident occurrence date, we don't actually capture that information, or at least that date. What we do capture is the date that the incident occurred, because that determines which academic year you're supposed to report it in. Now, an indication about whether or not that incident involves a statutory offense. A statutory offense, what we're talking about is the specific Ed Code sections 48900 and 48915. In that section of Ed Code, it outlines all of the things that students can do that are suspendable or expellable offenses. Okay, we call them 48900, 48915 violations, otherwise known as statutory offenses. So if a specific student committed one of those statutory offenses, you're going to see a yes in that column. Okay, what's really important about that statutory offense indicator is that if there is a yes in that column, it means that you're also going to have to tell us in a different file, the student offense file, specifically which of those Ed codes were violated. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Also, some of these students will end up getting either expelled or suspended for some of their statutory offenses. In those cases, and particularly for students with disabilities, after 10 days, after they've been suspended or expelled for 10 days, you are required by law to provide instructional support that is in alignment with the instruction and services outlined in those students' IEPs. Okay, so you have to tell us whether or not the student received instructional support if in fact they were suspended or expelled for those ed code violations. And then finally, removal to interim alternative setting reason code. If that student was put into a 45-day placement because they were a danger to themselves or others, then you would tell us the reason that they were put into that 45-day placement there. Okay, so moving on, we're going to focus here on incident 1. Okay, so incident 1, for every incident, every single one, there will always be results for every student. So if you are reporting an incident that involved multiple students, you're going to have to report results for each of those students. So here, you'll see, again, we've highlighted the key fields here, that there's an incident ID, again, and that is what links this file back to the incident file. Okay, so you have to use the same incident ID that you created for that particular incident. And you will see that each of the students that were in that incident have a set of results. In this case, you'll see the incident result code is 100 for pseudo student and 110 for phony pupil. So 100 is a suspension. Okay, they were suspended. 110 is an in-school suspension. So 100 is out-of-school suspension. 110 is in-school suspension. You also have to tell us the incident result authority. Who was the body that administered that incident result? Who suspended the student? Who expelled the student? Was it a administrative personnel, school personnel? Was it a judge? Was it I don't know. There's a couple of values in there, and we'll go over those in a little bit. But off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly what they all are. Then for specifically for suspensions and expulsions, you have to tell us the duration of that suspension or expulsion. So pseudo students had out-of-school suspension for 5 days, and phony pupil had in-school suspension for 5 days. Now, you'll also see at the very last column is an incident result modification code. So when do we use an incident result modification code? That code is used, for example, when a student is recommended for expulsion and the board decides rather than expelling the student, they want to put the student on a behavioral contract, okay? And that the terms of that behavioral contract have to be adhered to, and if they're not, then the expulsion could eventually be reinstated. Okay, but let's just say, for argument's sake, that the kid was great. They adhered to the terms of the contract. So if that's the case, you would still report the expulsion. However, in this incident result modification code, you could tell us that the enforcement was suspended, which means we did not enforce this expulsion because we put them on a behavioral contract. So if any sort of disciplinary action was modified in any way, either it was shortened or it was the enforcement was suspended, then you go ahead and populate that field. All right, so now moving on to the student offense file. Okay, once again, the key link between all three of these files is that incident ID. Okay, so you have to use that incident ID in all three of these files in order to connect the data for each of these students. The student offense file, as I told you, when you submit your data in the incident file, and I just kind of want to show you one more time, just so we're clear. If you look at the statutory offense indicator for incident number 1 for both of these students, it's saying yes, these students committed statutory offenses. Okay, so that again is an indication that you're going to need records for those students in the student offense file, because you have to tell us specifically which offenses those students committed. So in this case, the student offense code is a 3-digit code for a specific education code violation. And we're going to go over the code sets in just a little bit so you can kind of get an idea of where to find all of this information. So in this case, pseudo student committed offense 506, and then phony pupil committed offense 510. Now, if either of those offenses were associated with any type of weapon, brandishing a knife, if it's a firearm related incident, then the weapon category code would have to also be populated. So we do have some dependencies there. All right, so this is what our complete submission would look like, okay? And again, it's just reiterating the previous slide. So you would submit the incident file in blue, the, why am I blanking on this? The incident result file, which is the coral color, and then the student offense file, which is the green. All three of these files would be required for students who committed statutory offenses. Now, if there were students that did not commit statutory offenses, however, their incidents involved restraint or seclusion, specifically, let's take a look at incident number 2 at the top. We've got faux use, which is the very last row in blue. You'll see that that individual, their specific incident did not involve a statutory offense, which means they didn't violate an ed code. Okay, so what that tells us is that the result was either restraint or seclusion. So for that particular student, you will notice that they do not have, they have incident results, which is the coral, which tells us that the student was restrained or secluded. So incident result 501. But you'll notice in green, we don't have a record for that student. And that's because they did not commit a statutory offense. All right, so do you want me to answer some of these questions, or are you guys kind of handling them? Anything?
We're walking through them.
Okay, perfect.
We'll save the tough ones for you, Brandy.
Oh, yeah, not today. Okay, now, where are all the templates located that you would need to fill out? So the CalPADS user manual is generally something that is very well known to all of you that actually work in CalPADS, but some of you from the NPS sites may not actually work in CalPADS. This is the link to the batch template file. So we have 3 batch templates, and I'm going to go ahead and open this up, and then I will share that screen with you. Okay, so what you should be seeing now is the CalPADS file that says batch file templates. So we have lots of files in CalPADS that we capture, but specifically the 3 that you will be interested in are each of these. Okay, so what these batch files do is they're templates that basically tell you all of the information that we need. So let's go ahead and open up the student incident template. And I apologize, my Excel has kind of been acting a little bit wonky today. Oh, did I not share it? Take it a minute. I was trying to get all these documents open before we started this webinar, and my Excel program is acting very strangely. Oh, doesn't seem to be opening up. Nate, do you happen to have it open by any chance?
I do.
Oh, there it is. Okay, I got it. All right, let me just do a new share here. Here we go. Okay, so you will notice that there are several fields here, and each of these fields are required to be populated, and you will see that in cases where the field is required, it'll tell you exactly what is required to be populated in that field. Okay. In some cases, you may have to work with your CalPADS administrators, specifically for the districts that you work with, to get some of this related information. For example, the reporting LEA county district code, the school of attendance code, things like that. Obviously for NPS schools, we want to know not only the normal school of attendance, but also the NPS school of attendance. Okay, so there are batch templates for each one of these files, the student incident result, as well as the student offense file. Anything else that you wanted to touch on, Nate, with respect to these templates that folks should know about?
I would like, yeah, you know, a lot of times it's daunting. You see a template that you're unfamiliar with. But the best thing, the thing that they will provide, if you use them as a reference, is you can see what is required by your CalPADS LEA administrator. So Brandy mentioned that you may not have the student's SSID or some of that information. That's fine. Either A, it can be a communication point where you request it so that you can send them the accurate information, or you can populate what you know. I think it also will kind of shows you why on both ends the communication needs to come early, as you both may not be available at the same time. And so, you know, this is required information regardless if you're the one reporting it or not. So if you don't hear from your CalPADS coordinator, don't hesitate to reach out for them. And I think we'll discuss how you can do that shortly.
Okay. So by the way, the batch templates, they were uploaded to the documentation in the CDE box link. So you can get to them from the CalPADS user manual, but I did also put those into the CDE box link. Okay, so the CalPADS file specifications, there are also several other pieces of documentation that kind of give you some insight into what all of these things mean. So our file specifications documents gives you definitions for all of these columns that you're seeing in the batch templates. So for example, here's an excerpt. You see statutory offense indicator, student instructional support indicator. It gives you a comprehensive definition. It tells you whether or not there are required code values for that particular data element. So is there a specific set of values that you have to use when you're populating that? And then the comments column will give you some additional information. So for example, the statutory offense indicator, if you look at the comments, it says, if the value in here is yes, then the student offense and student incident result records must be submitted for the incident and students involved. If it's no, then the student incident result record must be submitted, but the student offense is actually not required. Okay, so everything that I just explained to you on some of the prior slides is also documented here in the CalPADS file specification. Now, if there are other validations that apply to this, and many of these actually may not apply to NPS schools because this is something that your CalPADS administrators will eventually have to deal with. But if there are any other checks that are done on those data when they're uploaded to CalPADS, it will be in the validation column. And then finally, the required field is, does this field have to be populated? There's a yes there, it means it has to be populated. And sometimes you'll see in the student instructional support indicator, it says if the statutory offense indicator equals yes, then you have to tell us whether or not instructional support was provided. Okay. All right, the code set. This is an excerpt from our code set document, And we're going to take you through sort of a cheat sheet that Nate helped put together for you guys when we first did this. Each of the data elements that requires a specific range of values or a code set is documented in our CalPath code sets document. So what you'll see is the code set name. You will see a coded value for that. You'll see the actual name of the code, and then a comprehensive definition. So as you can see here, we do have definitions for physical restraint that do refer to the ed code citations, as well as mechanical restraint, seclusion, school-related arrest, no action, and this is just a subset, right? There are obviously more codes in the code set document. All right, reporting timeline, key dates. So as of yesterday, our end of year submissions were scheduled to open on May 9th. That has since been delayed, okay? So we will not be opening the end of year submissions on May 9th. And for those of you in the NPS realm, has everything to do with a major project that we just implemented into CalPads and some defects and issues associated with that project that we have to get resolved before we decide to open the end of year submission. So just be aware that, you know, it was scheduled to open on May 9th, but it was delayed. Okay. So ideally, what should happen in a normal year is that the NPS schools will take a look at all of the students that they've served for LEAs between July 1st and June 30th. And they will compile all of this information in these batch templates. And that NPS school is going to send each of the LEAs whose students it serves, the student incident, student offense, student incident result files to that particular LEA. So the time frame for that is from July 1st of the prior year all the way through June 15th. I mean, if you want to wait towards the end of the year, you can do that, but you should have information to those folks ideally by June 15th. Okay. Our end of year submission does open in May, but you want to set up some sort of regular reporting schedule with your LEAs that will make it much easier for them at the end of the year. Because remember, those CalPath administrators have to take the information you give them, they have to put that into their student information system and then submit it up to CalPath. Okay, so, and that process takes a while, particularly right now. Then those data go through an approval process at the LEA level. So ideally, the LEA should approve their data by July 15th. We should get, in some cases, for students with disabilities in particular, there are specific reports that have to be reviewed by the SELPA, and the SELPA should approve by July 29th. Then finally, we have an amendment window so the LEAs can make any necessary changes. August 26th is the current amendment window closing. So August 26th is the deadline. But again, remember, we're reporting incident data from July 1st through June 30th of the academic year. All right, so next steps for those of you in the NPS realm. Where is this information being tracked locally? I mean, one question you really have to ask yourself is, am I capturing all of the data that are required for IDEA reporting at my NPS for these students? Am I capturing all of this information? My hope is that the answer is yes, okay? If so, where is it going to be tracked? Is it tracked within the student information system within your NPS school, or is it tracked external to that student information system? If you want to put it in your student information system, are there changes that have to happen in that student information system in order to get the data in there? Next, who's going to be responsible for tracking all of these incidents or putting these incidents into whatever repository you choose at the NPS school? And then finally, who is going to be the point of contact to compile this information and communicate it to the LEAs whose students you serve on a routine and regular basis? Okay. If you want to contact your CalPads administrator for the districts whose students you serve, we have provided a link here to the LEA contacts list, and that should give you, there are some instances where sometimes the contact information is out of date, and if so, you can contact us at CDE and we'll try to find out who the current CalPADS administrator is. But for the most part, the information in that contact database is pretty good. And so you can contact those individuals. But it's really important at the NPS that you figure out who's going to be responsible for doing these things locally. Okay, communication between the NPS and the LEA is absolutely crucial. As Nate said, sometimes you're not going to have all of the information necessary to complete these files, but your CalPADS administrators, for the most part, are very familiar with the information that's required in these files. So reach out to your LEAs, get the necessary information that you need to compile all of these files at the end of the year. Now, the special education data coordinators, the student information system data coordinators, those should be the first resource, particularly for NPS staff to reach out to. All right, so here are some additional resources. The first link is for our CalPADS systems documentation. That is where all of the code set information is. This code set information, it's the CalPADS file specifications that we went over. We've got the CalPADS user manual, and then CSIS, who are our training partners, there are lots of resources available on their website, and they also have a link to a YouTube page where eventually the recording of this particular training will be placed once we've completed it. And the last thing that I wanted to show you was a document that is in the CDE box site that I sent you.
Well, while you do that, Brandy,
sure.
Those of you at an NPS school, you're probably unfamiliar with those of us at CSIS, but the link on the screen at the very top is intended to be the first line of communication. So, of course, you're better off contacting your CalPADS coordinator or your school district COE's representatives if you have questions. However, if you're trying to find definitions for codes or fields or combinations of or just what data do I need, you go blank after you leave this webinar, feel free to reach out to us. It would be helpful if you just told us, I'm at an NPS school. That way we understand you're not the person reporting this information. And so the nature of your question will be a little bit clearer, and we can provide you the information you need, even help you find a contact if that is what you need.
Okay, so what I'm going to show you now, if my computer will cooperate, is the NPS incident guide.
So, Brandy, we are almost at time. There are a couple questions that I don't know if I could answer right off the bat, but you might be able to. So kind of like maybe, I know, multitasking. So if they did not have a statutory offense, do they need to report? So if they had a statutory offense but did not result in a suspension expulsion, they still need to report in the SOFF, right?
Yes. Okay. So if you look at our incident result codes, and I'm going to share my screen because, like I said, Nate put together an incident guide for you guys, which actually consolidates all of the code sets. So if you look at our student offense code set here, so there's code sets for each of these. One tells you the definitions of each of these fields, and then there are incident result codes. So in this case, you had a statutory offense. So let's just say the student physically assaulted another student. So it was a, physical altercation. Well, you decided, and the administration decided, that it was best not to suspend or expel the student, but you may have done other means of correction. Okay, so the key here is, if they violated ed code, you report it, period. If it resulted in something other than suspension and expulsion, then you just tell us that. just tell us that it resulted in other means of correction. Okay, so for each of these, you'll see the student incident results code sets are here. So we've got out of school suspension, etc. All of the other, so each of the file formats are here, as well as each of the code sets that you will be required to populate in each of those fields. So take a look at the NPS student incident guide, and that'll give you a lot of the information that you need to populate those batch templates. Okay, next question.
So, and I think this one's a more complicated question. I might have to go back. So the question is related to attendance and suspension. So I don't know if we've had this before, but is an in-house suspension considered present for ADA? There's some layers there for students with disabilities too.
So, I mean, the short answer is if a student gets in-school suspension, they can claim ADA as long as they are supervised by a certificated staff person.
Oh. And provided services similar to their IEP within the FAPE in the LRE, which means they have similar access to their services and supports and the students they would have in their placement. So general education access. Okay, what are the primary keys between the SINC, SIRS, and SOFF? Is it SSID or is there a different one?
So I'm not sure if you mean foreign keys or primary keys.
Primary.
So you're asking what, yeah. So I can't tell you off the top of my head. The CalPACS file specifications has a narrative section before each of these file formats. And in that narrative section, it tells you the primary keys within each of those files. Now, if you're asking what the link is between all those three files, it is the reporting LEA, the SSID, and the reporting LEA and the incident ID. Does that sound about right, Nate?
School of attendance, academic year, and incident ID.
Ah, there we go. Academic year, reporting LEA, school of attendance, and incident ID.
So the removal to interim alternative setting is only for students with disabilities, correct? So they'll get an error if they put it on students without disabilities.
You will get a certification validation, yes. Which means, yeah, this is wrong. And also, in the past, just be very cognizant, CalPADS administrators. Those in the SPED realm know what 45-day placements are. They're very familiar with that terminology. They know what interim alternative placements are. However, CalPADS administrators, you are not the individuals that determine whether or not it's an interim alternative placement. You need to contact your SPED staff. You don't make an assumption just because they're placed somewhere else and because it's less than 45 days that it's always an interim alternative placement. I mean, interim alternative placements are sort of last, you know, the last thing that, or I don't know what I'm trying to say here. You know, what am I trying to say, Shiloh?
So when there's so interim alternative placements is when there's an incident where a child is endangered themselves or others and attending that same setting, right? So if the student's supposed to be in a regular class, full day with supports, but attending that setting is not safe for them or others, they can be temporarily placed in another setting. A lot of times it's a different school site. And so, but it's only up to 45 days and they will hold an IEP meeting to sort of determine what the next steps are. So that's why that occurs. It's a very unique case. And then in the alternative setting, they need to be provided the similar services and supports in their IEP. But typically it's a different school site because of safety reasons. Okay. The list for your listserv link, you missed a P at the end. So I don't know why. And then you already talked about the dates.
And we you know, that slide, as I started going through it, what I realized was that there may be a couple of typos on there. So in terms of the dates, the other thing I would say is just kind of stay tuned with respect to all of those dates, because like I said, everything right now is sort of in a state of flux. So keep an eye out on the listserv for that. Cami, the NPS incident guide is in the CDE box site that was provided there. Was the link sent to you?
Yeah, so we sent out a link to this training that would go out to all of our non-public schools on our listserv. So it should have gone out to all of them. So the instructional support piece, and I have actually a little thing I can just throw right into, where did I put it? I'll find the little, there's a little, yes. So if you are suspending a student and for more than 10 days, there's a lot of things that happen. And when that occurs, you have to provide instructional supports. And that is typically similar to what they have in their IEP. And I have a little blurb. I will send it. I will try and put it in the chat right now.
But bottom line, Isabel, is it's not just handing the kid a homework packet. It's making sure they have the supports and resources necessary to implement what's outlined in their IEP.
Mm-hmm.
And Shiloh, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this terminology. So EUSD student is placed at an NCA. That student has a suspension. Does NCA report it? NCA, I'm assuming, is like a NPS school, maybe?
Yeah.
So EUSD ultimately, Tamara, is responsible for, the district is responsible for reporting data for students who are attending NPSs. However, it is the responsibility of that NPS school to provide you that information to report, which is why we're all here today.
So somebody was asking questions about the interim alternative placement is about parent consent. The interim alternative placement doesn't, I don't think, specific to parent consent. I can look it up. I don't have the statute right in front of me, but it's not about consent. It's about the placement in the IEP. It's changing the placement of the students without holding an IEP meeting. So, so that you may say, you know, today there was an incident, tomorrow the student needs to go to another school. You invoke that piece in order for the student to go to that school the next day. And then you determine, do we need to hold an IEP meeting? Do we need to hold another type of discussion with the parent? Do we need to do other things? Do we need to hold an amendment? There's a lot of things that need to occur, but the interim alternative placement is about that. It's about making changes to where the child would sort of go to school and their placement without holding a new IEP or an amendment. So a lot of people were saying, wait, I don't like this template. It doesn't work for me. Like, do I have to use it? Is this something that's required? And I think the answer, what I've been saying is, like, if you have something better that works for you, continue to use that. This was something we provided to help support you, and you didn't have anything else. Brandy, I don't know if that was what you were going to say.
Well, I mean, I think the issue here is I get that NPS schools want a template to use that they can track for all LEAs. So, I mean, here's just a suggestion. If at the beginning of the year you downloaded these batch file templates and you kept track of all data for every kid, for every LEA that you served, and you kept track of them in these 3 different spreadsheets, right? You can, at the end of the year, parse this out and give it to each LEA. You could track it all in one place. I mean, but the point is, you don't want to share data with another LEA for another LEA's kids, right? We realize in NPS schools, you have one student body, right? But those students belong to different LEAs. And so however you decide to track it, you're going to need to parse out the data for each LEA whose kids you serve at the end of the year. That's the bottom line. And so these templates provide you a basis to do that. And I would say my advice is work with your technical staff at your NPS sites. They can help try and put together some sort of spreadsheet or some sort of database, or again, make changes in your student information system in the NPS to be able to track all of these things.
And I think we have dropped about 100 participants, and we are about 10 minutes over your time. We appreciate those who kind of stuck with us. We have answered all the questions that we have so far in the chat or in the Q&A. Thank you all so much for your time on this. This is recorded. We will work on cleaning up the closed captioning and try and get it out so you all can have access to it as quickly as possible. Again, we appreciate your time, your dedication to this work, because we know it's really tough right now. So thank you so much. Brandy, I don't know if you have anything else to say.
No, because my tongue is tied today. So I'm done.
This is the 11th hour of her talking, so she doesn't stop talking. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Brandy. We appreciate you all so much. And thank you all to our wonderful folks. We will see you soon.
Thanks.
Goodbye.